A child was born in the deep waters of Glee Anselm, but not in silence. The sea sang that day, not with joy, but with something slower, something cautious, as if it already knew the path this boy would take. This is the story of the smiling Jedi, the warrior of calm waters, the knight who died with grace. Before the Clone Wars, before Grievous, before the green blade lit the darkness of Coruscant's high towers, there was only the ocean. Kit Fisto was not like the other Nautolan children. He laughed less, he listened more. His eyes followed the movement of tides like he was trying to understand them. He would sit alone near coral ridges, letting the sea creatures pass without reaching for them. Nautolans are sensitive to pheromones. They don't read emotions by sight or voice. They feel them, in waves, in pulses, in scent trails carried by current. And from the beginning, Kit could smell something no one else could fear. It clung to the older hunters who smiled too wide. It drifted off the merchants when storms threatened their cargo. It lingered behind every bold voice. He never told anyone. He just watched. His parents were proud but puzzled. He wasn't slow. He wasn't shy, but he was separate. Present yet distant, like someone who already knew this life wasn't his forever. One day, when Kit was still small enough to ride the ocean vents like a game, he saw a predator pass by, a large razorfish. It moved like a shadow through sunlit water. Most children ran, but Kit stayed still, not frozen in fear, calm, almost curious. When asked later why he didn't flee, he only shrugged. He wasn't set hungry, he said. It wasn't set a guess, it was certainty. The elders called him strange, wise maybe, but strange. Kit didn't mind. He didn't seek approval, he didn't even speak much. He trained with his peers, hunted with his cousins, played when expected, but his real connection was with the ocean, with the weight of silence and the movement of things unseen. He began to feel something pulling at him. A presence, a warmth that didn't come from the sun. At night he would stare through the rippling ceiling of water and feel like something was watching him from the stars. Not threatening, not frightening, just waiting. Then the waiting ended. One morning, the elders called for him. A ship had arrived, silent, sleek, wrong. It landed without force, without sound, but its shape was not of Glee Anselm. And the person who stepped out wore no armor, no weapons, just a robe, brown, damp with ocean spray. He introduced himself not with a name, but with a question. Do you dream of things you've never seen? Kit didn't sit answer. He didn't sit need to. The Nautolan boy just stepped forward and placed his hand on the Jedi's outstretched palm. The currents whispered, and this time they whispered goodbye. Coruscant was louder than the ocean, but Kit didn't flinch. Most initiates from water worlds struggled on dry land. The noise, the pace, the stillness of the air. But Kit moved through the Jedi temple like he had already been there in a dream. He walked past columns and fountains, past masters and datapads, without asking questions. He listened, he watched, he remembered. The other younglings clashed sticks and traded boasts, but Kit's attention was on how they breathed when they struck, how their energy shifted when they missed. He noticed who looked over their shoulder before attacking, and who didn't. He never struck first, but he rarely missed. Form I Chicho was taught to all initiates. It was the oldest, most balanced style. Many saw it as primitive. Kit saw it as water, simple on the surface, unpredictable underneath. He began to train alone, not from pride, but from rhythm. His movements flowed best when he was allowed to move with silence. One instructor watched him from above the temple garden, unseen. After 2 hours of solo training, she whispered, "He fights like the sea." That instructor was Master Narel Gan. She had studied under Yaddle. She believed the Force was clearest in quiet places. She became Kit's first teacher. And she never once raised her voice. She taught through observation, through questions with no clear answers, through challenges that came without warning and ended without praise. Kit thrived under her. She once blindfolded him in the temple archives and asked him to find her, not by sound but by presence. It took him 7 minutes. When he reached her, she wasn't set, smiling. "You didn't sense me," she said. "You remembered the pattern of my movement." Kit paused. "Isn't Seth that sensing?" "No," she said. "It's Seth's knowing." That was the difference. Kit didn't rely on instinct alone. He collected data, slowly, calmly, until patterns emerged, and then he moved, without hesitation. One day, a small group of younglings was caught lying about an incident in the dining hall, a prank. No one was harmed, but the truth was buried. Kit said nothing. He hadn't been involved, but he had seen. When Master Gan asked if he knew who was responsible, Kit only said, "Does it matter if they don't feel guilt?" She looked at him for a long time before replying. "It will, one day." Not all his lessons came from the temple. Sometimes, in the quiet hours before morning, Kit would sit by the fountains and close his eyes. He would listen for the ocean, but he no longer missed it. What he missed was the scent of emotion. The temple was filled with order and reason, with discipline and calm, but beneath it all, he could still smell doubt, fear, even envy, especially in the older students. And the higher he rose in training, the stronger that scent became. He began to understand that peace was not the same as harmony, that calm was not the same as stillness, that the Jedi, for all their wisdom, carried emotions like ripples beneath a still pond. He carried them too, but he carried them differently. When Kit was 12, he was taken to Ilum, the frozen caves, the trial of the crystal. He did not panic when the wind howled. He did not rush when the path split. He walked with purpose and silence, and when he found his crystal, he smiled, but not because he was proud. He smiled because he recognized the feeling it gave him. It was the same feeling he had when the currents changed direction. Something old, something deep, something calling him forward. The day his master arrived, the sky over Coruscant was a pale, exhausted blue. Kit had just completed a silent training session in the temple gardens. He was older now, still young, but taller, more centered. His saber training was no longer practice, it was readiness. The other younglings still whispered about his calm, how he never raised his voice, how he never rushed. But even Kit felt it when the tall figure stepped into the courtyard. The air shifted, not like a storm, more like a shadow blocking out light. The Jedi who approached him was not famous, not a council member, not a decorated general, but Kit knew immediately this man had seen death, not just in battle, up close, personal, carried it. His name was Master Talo Ven. He said little, and what he said was heavy. He had spent years on border planets no one talked about, planets where Jedi weren't welcomed with banners, where peace was a negotiation between warlords and memory. His robes were frayed at the hem. His saber had a nick on the hilt that had never been polished out. He looked at Kit for a long time, then said simply, "You don't fight to win, you fight to understand." Kit nodded once. That was enough. Their ship left that night. Kit didn't tell his friends. He didn't look back at the temple. He simply boarded and sat in silence beside his new master, surrounded by stars that didn't feel as distant as they once had. Their first mission together wasn't that glamorous. A small conflict on Iktoch, laborers striking against a planetary magistrate's control grid. No major battles, no Sith, just pain, misunderstanding, years of it, people who didn't speak the same language, not in words but in anger. Kit wanted to fix it, to bring fairness. But Master Ven stopped him. "They don't want fairness," he said. "They want someone to listen." So they did. For 3 days they sat among the laborers, ate with them, slept near their fires. Kit listened not just with his ears, but with his senses, and what he smelled was more than fear or anger. It was exhaustion, it was betrayal, it was hope buried so deep it barely had a scent left. He returned to the magistrate alone, while his master stayed behind. The negotiation lasted hours, but in the end, nothing was signed. Instead, Kit gave the workers something else. He taught them how to create a legal channel to the Republic Agricultural Board, not justice, but a voice. It worked, slowly. Later, as they left orbit, Master Ven said, "You didn't bring peace." Kit waited. "You reminded them they still had the right to ask for it." Every mission after that deepened the lesson. Kit saw planets where the Jedi were feared more than bounty hunters. He saw governments fall not through war, but through promises unkept. He met smugglers who were kinder than senators. He met Force sensitives who refused Jedi training because they had seen what war did to peacekeepers. Through it all, he rarely drew his lightsaber. But when he did, he moved like the sea, precise, relentless, gentle, even in aggression. He didn't wear his robe stiffly. He didn't quote the code often, but he remembered every lesson his first teacher whispered in the temple halls. Master Ven never praised him, never scolded him. But when he passed his trials, not in a duel, not in a battle, but by resolving a century-old blood feud on Caladan without violence, Master Ven gave him his old travel cloak. Not as a gift, as a reminder. It sets your turn to walk. When Kit Fisto was knighted, no horns sounded, no crowds gathered, just a quiet ceremony in the temple's hall of knighthood. Dozens passed through that chamber every year, but for Kit, it felt like the sea floor, silent, still, sacred. He didn't smile during the ceremony, not because he wasn't honored, but because something inside him had shifted. For years he had followed the current, let it guide him from Glee Anselm to Coruscant, from silence to service. But now, for the first time, he stood without a master, and the path ahead was not gentle. There was no farewell from Master Ven, only a nod. Kit returned to his quarters one last time, folded his robe, and stood for a moment in the center of the room. The sun from the Coruscant skyline cast long lines across the floor. He turned off the light and walked out. The next mission came quickly. A Jedi Knight is never still for long. The Republic was unraveling, not through war, but through tension. Outer Rim systems were threatening separation. Trade routes were closing. Refugees flowed from border conflicts no one wanted to name. Kit's first solo assignment was to Dantooine. Not to fight, to observe. A farming colony had accused Republic scouts of sabotage. Locals claimed their irrigation systems had been deliberately damaged. The Republic said it was an accident. The truth, as always, was murky. Kit didn't argue. He didn't posture. He walked the fields. He smelled the soil, the water, the fear. And he found the leak. It was real. It was old. It had been covered up. Not by the locals, not by the scouts, but by a Republic contractor paid to cut corners and bury the problem. He reported it quietly. The colonists never knew. The scouts were reassigned. Kit didn't ask for thanks. He just watched the irrigation system begin to run again. Water returned to the fields. The scent of stress faded. He left the next morning before the sun rose. That became his rhythm. Arrive, listen, repair, leave. He wasn't famous, not yet, but word spread among the Jedi. The Nautolan knight who didn't speak much, but always left things better than he found them. And always smiled, not with arrogance, not with certainty, but with quiet trust in the Force. When war broke out between two moons in the Taris system, Kit was sent as part of a small negotiation team. The Jedi Master in charge took command quickly. He spoke of the code, of compromise, of balance. But when talks failed and blasters fired, it was Kit who moved first. Not to strike, to shield. He protected the youngest aide on the diplomatic ship with his own body, absorbing the shockwave of a collapsing corridor with nothing but a deflection barrier and timing. After the battle, when the aide thanked him, Kit only said, "You were scared." The boy nodded. "And now you stir not." It was then the Jedi Council took notice, not just for his saber skill, but for something more difficult to measure: trust, presence, the ability to make people feel safe in chaos. And that, more than any victory, is what began to define him. He didn't speak loudly, but when he did, even senior masters listened. He didn't challenge orders, but when he hesitated, it mattered. Years later, when Kit Fisto was called to the Jedi High Council, he said nothing at first. Then he asked just one question: "Can I still leave when I need to?" They said yes. And so, he accepted. But when he stepped into the council chamber for the first time, when he looked across the circle of chairs and saw masters he had once trained beneath, he didn't smile. Not yet. Because deep inside, he could already sense it. The current was changing. And it wouldn't be long before the tides pulled everything away. The temple changed after knighthood, not in shape, in weight. Kit Fisto returned only briefly after his first missions. He walked the same halls, past the same stone statues, but now the air felt thicker. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was loaded, with questions unasked and thoughts left unfinished. The initiates looked at him differently. He had become what they were all trying to become, but he didn't feel complete. He felt adjusted, like a current that had bent itself around stone. He resumed his training, but this time with purpose, not to learn, to refine. Form had always felt natural to him. The fluid strikes, the wide arcs, the centered footwork. Others moved like fire, or wind, or thunder. Kit moved like water. He absorbed before responding. He turned momentum into advantage. But now he needed more than flow. The galaxy was shifting. The missions were darker now, more political, more dangerous. Words carried as much danger as weapons. In a world fraying at the edges, Kit knew the time would come when calm wouldn't be enough. So he practiced. He entered the temple training chamber at night, long after others had left. The lights were low. The hum of the ceiling vents matched his breath. He drew his saber and moved, slow, deliberate, balanced. He flowed through stances until his body remembered them without needing thought. He wasn't set training for a fight. He was training for a moment, the 1 second where hesitation would decide everything. And yet, no matter how fast he moved, he never lost the stillness. That was the difference. One morning, while meditating in the eastern archway, a temple guardian approached him. "Their set's a visitor," the guardian said. "An old friend." Kit opened his eyes. He already knew. Master Nautolan, his first instructor, stood beneath the long columns near the archive steps. Her robe was darker than he remembered, her eyes more tired. "You've grown," she said. "You haven't set," he replied. They didn't set laugh. She didn't speak of the past. She didn't ask about his missions. Instead, she led him to the upper dueling terrace. It was empty. The wind carried the sounds of the city, filtered and distant. "Show me," she said. Kit ignited his blade. She did the same. No words, no instruction, just movement. The duel wasn't fast. It wasn't loud. It felt like conversation without sound. Kit's blade moved in wide circles, deflecting, redirecting. Hers struck in short, sharp jabs, testing, measuring. 10 minutes passed, then 20. They didn't pause. She moved faster. He adapted. She angled downward, a heavy feint. He saw it coming, stepped aside, and countered with a graceful backhand. Then she stopped. He froze mid-motion. "Your defense is flawless," she said. But defense alone doesn't end conflict. Kit deactivated his saber. I know. She stepped forward. There will be moments when compassion will cost you lives. He didn't answer. She looked into his eyes. When that moment comes, don't hesitate. Kit watched her walk away. He stayed there long after she left, staring out over the skyline. The sun had begun to set. Its reflection danced off the temple spires, sharp and soft at the same time. He thought of her words. He didn't reject them, but something in him resisted. Even now, Kit believed in restraint, in mercy, in reading people before reacting to them. He had seen violence. He had seen what it left behind. Still, he knew she was right. One day mercy might not be enough. And when that day came, he would need to act, not as the calm observer, but as something else. Not a wave. A blade. The first time Kit Fisto took a life, it was over in seconds. It happened on Essalus, a mission that was supposed to be peaceful, a diplomatic escort for a senator threatened by local radicals. The situation was meant to be controlled. Guard the shuttle, ensure the meeting, return. But something went wrong in the lower levels. A sniper. The shot missed the senator by less than half a meter. Kit saw the angle, sensed the pressure, and moved before anyone else did. He chased the sound down through steel corridors, past merchant stalls and half-lit alleys. The man who fired the shot was cornered in a loading bay. He wore no armor, just rags and panic. He raised a blaster, not to kill, but to survive. Kit blocked the bolt. Then another. Then a third. The fourth shot came faster, closer. Kit moved. When the blade passed through the man's chest, it felt like striking water. Quick, silent, complete. The man crumpled. His body slid against the wall. The blaster clattered on the durasteel. Kit stood still. He didn't look at the body. He looked at his own hands. There was no anger in the strike, no hatred, no fear, just instinct, movement, reaction. The senator lived. The threat was neutralized. The report was filed. But that night, Kit sat alone in his quarters and left the lights off. He didn't cry. He didn't question the code. But the air around him felt different, heavy, and for the first time since he left Glee Anselm, he couldn't smell anything at all. The temple healers said it was fatigue, a temporary disruption in sensory input, but Kit knew better. The moment the saber passed through another living being, something inside him had pulled away, not from guilt, from loss. He hadn't wanted to kill, but he hadn't hesitated. And that knowledge settled in his bones like salt in still water. From that point on, he trained harder. Not to become more dangerous, to become more precise. He studied combat styles outside his own. Sorisu with its wall-like defense, Ataru with its speed and daring, even DJM-So with its raw power. But he always returned to Shi-Cho. Form I reminded him of home, of balance, of wide, sweeping motions meant to disarm rather than destroy. The other Jedi noticed. Kit was becoming known not just as a diplomat, but as a warrior who avoided war. A fighter who could end conflicts without raising his voice. He didn't avoid combat, but he didn't seek it. And when battle came, he moved like he was trying to stop time, giving enemies a chance to surrender with every step. He often did. But not always. On Orlean 6, a separatist weapons ring had taken over an old Jedi outpost. Kit led the assault team. Clones, mostly young, determined, efficient. The enemy held children hostage, used them as cover. No negotiation. Kit made the call. He created a distraction, slipping through a rear ventilation shaft. He reached the hostages, freed them. The battle outside was still raging. But when he returned, 2 of his men were dead. The enemy commander was laughing. And Kit Fisto, for the first time in a very long time, struck without restraint. His saber blurred in wide arcs, not messy, not uncontrolled, but final. There were no survivors on the enemy line. Later, when the debrief came, he said only one thing. They were told to stand down. The Council approved. The Republic sent thanks. But Kit didn't smile. That night he trained again. Alone. Slower. And as he moved, he whispered a question to the empty air. How do you stay a Jedi when the galaxy demands something else? The Jedi trials were not always formal. In ancient times, they were shaped by war, by need, by the will of the Force itself. And though the temple still held traditions, some knights passed their trials without ever stepping inside the proving halls. Kit Fisto's trial came on a world with no name. A Republic cruiser had intercepted a distress signal from a derelict transport drifting between hyperlanes. No registration, no known origin. Life signs were faint. Kit was nearby and volunteered to investigate. He boarded alone. The ship's air was stale, lights flickered, no sound, just the low hum of failing systems. He moved carefully, every step slow, every breath measured. Then he saw the crew, 3 of them, barely alive, bodies wrapped in emergency foil, eyes wide with fear. They hadn't sent the distress signal. Someone else had. The 4th signature was deeper in the ship. Kit followed it. He found the man near the core, pale, still, breathing steady, no weapons, no markings, just calm. And then the man stood, and the Force changed. It wasn't dark in the way of the Sith, it wasn't hate or rage. It was absence, a cold, blank stillness that bent the air around it. The man smiled. "You such a young," he said. "That such is good." Kit didn't draw his saber. Not yet. The man continued. "They always send the young ones first to see if they shall hesitate." Kit didn't speak. The duel began without a sound. No taunts, no grand gestures, just motion, clean and brutal. The stranger moved like he had fought Jedi before. His blade was stolen, a red saber, old and cracked. His stance was jagged, wild, built to disrupt form. Kit stayed in Shicho, wide, circular, adaptive. But something was wrong. The stranger didn't break, didn't slow. He moved like someone who had already accepted death and was trying to take someone with him. Kit adjusted, tightened his stance, focused his energy. But it wasn't set enough. The stranger clipped his shoulder, a shallow burn, but deep enough to matter. Pain rushed in. And with it, something else. Doubt. The man laughed. "Good," he said. "Now you feel it." Kit fell back, breathing heavy. The corridor was narrow. He couldn't retreat far. He needed to end this, but not through anger. Not through fear. Through clarity. He dropped low, redirected a strike, and pivoted under the man's guard. His blade came up, fast, clean, and passed through the man's side. The red saber dropped. The man didn't scream. He looked at Kit and whispered, "Still young," and collapsed. Kit stood there in the quiet hum of dying systems, his shoulder bleeding, his breath uneven. He didn't feel triumph, only silence. When the Republic team arrived hours later, they found Kit still on the ship. He had treated the wounded, stabilized the engines, and set the course for nearest port. He said nothing about the fight. He didn't need to. The report spoke for itself. 3 lives saved, 1 life ended. 1 night changed. Back at the temple, the council reviewed everything. The footage, the scans, the injuries, the outcome. They called Kit in. No ceremony, just words. Yusef passed. He nodded. But even as he left, he felt no celebration. Because that man, the stranger, hadn't fought like a Sith. hadn't shouted about darkness or power. He had fought like someone with nothing left. And Kit wondered, how many more like him were out there? Not fallen, not twisted, just broken. Willing to die, if only to be remembered. The Force had tested him. Not just his strength, his mercy. And mercy, Kit was learning, was harder to hold on to the longer you carried a blade. The wound on his shoulder healed in days, the one inside did not. Kit Fisto continued to serve. The missions came fast, often without warning. His skill, his calm, his ability to act without cruelty, these were noticed. The Council began assigning him to more volatile systems, places where diplomacy had failed and war had not yet begun. But something had changed. He still moved with the same grace, still carried his blade like a current through water, but behind his steady gaze, there was a question that wouldn't leave him alone. What if peace no longer wanted to be found? On Tyr, he mediated a dispute between two mining clans. Their war wasn't about territory, it was about old blood spilled by people long dead. Kit offered terms, solutions, reconciliations. They refused. A week later, both leaders were assassinated. On Cerealia, he helped evacuate a village caught in the path of a pirate blockade. The people were scared, malnourished, hopeless. When the blockade lifted, Kit watched from the cruiser window as those same villagers looted the next ship that landed. They weren't set evil. They were tired. And Kit realized something the Temple never said out loud. The Force is in all things, but not all things are ready to listen to it. He returned to Coruscant with new scars, not on his skin, on his trust. The Jedi taught patience, control, serenity. But out in the field, those things were often seen as weakness. The galaxy wasn't set asking for balance. It was begging for power. Still, Kit did not break. He adapted. He began to say less in council briefings. He didn't debate doctrine. He didn't offer visions. He observed, and when called upon, he delivered. Not loudly, not with drama, with results. Other Jedi began requesting him. Not because he inspired loyalty, because he brought a strange kind of clarity. His presence made others slow down, reconsider, hesitate before striking. Even in combat, his energy felt different. Like someone who had accepted that death would come, but had no need to rush toward it. On one assignment to Anshan, he worked alongside Master Luminara Unduli. They cleared a siege without drawing sabers, talked a warlord down with nothing but positioning and calm. Later, Luminara said to him, "You don't just want to win, you want them to understand why they lost." Kit nodded. Because that was true. Violence ended battles, but understanding ended cycles. And Kit was tired of watching the same pain repeat on new faces. But not all lessons could be learned in the temple. Not all truths were written in the Jedi Code. He was beginning to understand that compassion, real, unshaken compassion, was not passive. It was endurance, the ability to see the worst in people and still protect them, to lose comrades and still shield strangers, to be wounded again and again and still offer peace before drawing a blade. That was the path he chose, not because it was safe, because it was right. One evening, he visited the archives, alone. The temple was quiet, the lower levels were dim. He found an old entry, a hollow record of Master Qui-Gon Jinn. It was short, unmarked. In it, Qui-Gon said, "Your enemy is not the one who strikes you. It sits the voice that tells you to stop trying." Kit turned the recording off and stood there in silence. No Jedi was perfect, no path was clean, but he would not stop trying. Even if the galaxy forgot the meaning of peace, he would remember. There rests an old saying among clone troopers: if Kit Fisto is smiling, you still have time. That wasn't meant as a joke, it was a warning. A strange kind of comfort, because when everything was collapsing, when ships were falling from orbit, when blasters lit the air like lightning, Kit Fisto still smiled. Not to hide fear, but to carry something heavier without letting it break him. Before the war had a name, before the Senate gave it uniforms and speeches, there were already battles being fought, unseen, forgotten, and Kit Fisto was sent to them. On Mon Cala, political tensions had turned into riots. The Quarren blamed the Mon Calamari for economic control. The Mon Calamari accused the Quarren of sabotage. Years of pressure cracked open in one night. Jedi were sent in small numbers. Kit was one of them. He didn't speak when he arrived. He just removed his cloak, stepped into the water, and stayed underwater for hours, listening. Not with his ears, with his senses. He felt the anger moving through currents like poison. He tracked its source, a weapons cache hidden in the seaweed forests, Quarren separatists planning a strike. He found them, surrounded them, alone. When they raised their weapons, Kit didn't draw his saber, he just smiled and said, "You don't want to fire in water." They didn't stat. He led them out without bloodshed. The Republic called it a success. The Temple marked it as complete. But Kit knew better. The peace wouldn't set hold, because the roots of war were no longer in weapons, they were in need, fear, memory. And those things could not be cut with a saber. Still, he kept trying. In the Outer Rim, he negotiated with factions no one else would touch. Pirate coalitions, wounded militias, corrupted planetary guards. He entered rooms where trust had been extinct for decades. And still, he smiled. He never made threats, never raised his voice. But when he placed his saber on the table, not as a warning but as a signal of honesty, the air always changed. Some laughed. Some surrendered. Some tried to kill him. They didn't get far. Word spread. Kit Fisto was different. He didn't speak like a Jedi. He didn't posture like a politician. He moved like someone who had seen what happened when diplomacy failed and had no interest in seeing it again. To the Republic, he became a reliable hand. To the Jedi, a trusted envoy. To enemies, a mirror. He gave them one last chance to be better than their worst decisions. And when they refused, he ended it quickly. But the smile never left. Even when the battles grew louder, even when peacekeeping became war-making, even when the Jedi started questioning whether they were still protectors or just soldiers in better robes, he smiled. Because someone had to. Someone had to carry the calm, so others wouldn't fall apart. But that smile, as steady as it was, came at a cost. It hid exhaustion. It covered the cracks. And when the fighting paused and the silence returned, Kit didn't rest. He just waited for the next flashpoint, the next retreat, the next opportunity to hold the line between order and collapse, not because he was told to, because he believed, even now, that peace could still be pulled from the edge. If someone reached far enough. Some Jedi avoided assignments in the Outer Rim. Too remote, too unstable, too unpredictable. But Kit Fisto requested them. Not for glory, not for control, because those were the places where peace had already fled, and someone needed to follow. He was sent to Pamant during the collapse of its orbital shipyards. The local union leaders were desperate. The Techno-Union had begun pulling assets without warning. Workers were being laid off in entire sectors. Whole families left stranded in zero-gravity shells. Riots broke out. Kit arrived alone. The landing pad was already burning. He walked through smoke without activating his saber. Rescue teams shouted. Blaster fire cracked in the air. Somewhere a droid exploded. Still, he walked. He found the crowd gathered outside the central maintenance hub. Dozens of workers, armed, furious, holding a Techno-Union manager hostage. The manager was bleeding, not from blasters, but from panic. Kit stepped into the circle and spoke just one sentence. Who's Seth's willing to leave their child alone for a war that doesn't serve them? The silence spread like frost. One by one, the weapons dropped. Not because Kit threatened them, because he reminded them what they were risking. He escorted the hostage to safety, helped treat the wounded, then spent the night with the workers, eating their rations, listening to their stories. He filed no formal report. He left no record of the speech. But the incident ended without death, and that was enough. Other missions weren't sit as clean. On Troikan, he was deployed with a Jedi Knight named Bink Utrila, a talented Zabrek known for her tactical clarity. They were to intercept an arms transfer funding off-world mercenaries. The intel was flawed. The arms transfer was a disguised refugee movement. Entire families, dozens of transports, and armed guards protecting them. Yes, but not aggressors, survivors, smugglers hired only to keep children from being turned over to planetary enforcers. It should have been a standoff. Instead, it became a massacre. A local militia panicked, opened fire before Kit could intercept the order. Bink deflected half the bolts. Kit deflected the rest. But not fast enough. 3 transports exploded before they reached the sky. Afterward, Bink wanted to file charges, to push for sanctions, to demand justice from the Senate. Kit didn't argue, but he didn't join her. He walked the crash sites in silence. One of the surviving children, a girl no older than 7, looked up at him and said, "You were there. Why didn't you stop it?" He didn't answer. He just sat beside her and stayed. All night. That story never reached Coruscant. There was no outrage, no hearings, no apology. But Kit carried it with him. Like salt carried in water, unseen but always present. He began to learn that the Force wasn't loud on these worlds. It didn't sing or glow. It whispered. Through pain, through grief, through decisions made too late to undo. And so he listened more closely. On Atoa, he prevented a political assassination by noticing the slight tremor in a guard's hand. On Makana, he found a hidden slave ring just by following the pattern of silence in children's laughter. He became known not just as a warrior, but as a reader of situations others ignored. Because Kit didn't look for control. He looked for understanding. Even when it was too late. Even when peace was already gone. Because sometimes the point wasn't to restore peace. It was to remind the galaxy what it looked like, even if only for a moment. The Jedi were stretched thin. Whispers of war filled the Senate halls. Star systems aligned behind shadows. Separatist sympathies grew, not from corruption, but from exhaustion. The galaxy was tired of pretending it still worked. And Kit Fisto was still being sent into the cracks. Balance was no longer a distant goal. It was a daily fight, not between good and evil, but between patience and collapse. On Rendili, 2 Republic loyalist fleets nearly fired on each other over a misread signal. Kit arrived before the first shot. He didn't bark orders. He transmitted a single image, an intercepted message showing both admirals had been manipulated by a shared enemy. It wasn't even classified data. It was buried in plain sight. But no one had taken the time to look. Kit did. They stood down. No medals, no thanks. Just avoided disaster. But not all fractures could be sealed. On Corriva, a Jedi Knight had been captured during a trade route inspection. The captors were not pirates. They were civilians. Desperate, hungry, half believing that ransom might buy their colony more time before the Republic forgot them. The council debated. Kit went alone. He found the knight bound in a cold cell, bruised but breathing. He found the captors trembling, expecting death. He disarmed them without drawing his saber. When asked what punishment they would face, he only said, "You already live it." He brought supplies. He didn't report the names. And when he returned to the temple, he simply said the knight had been recovered, no violence required. Some on the council questioned his judgment, but they didn't instead question the result. Kit knew the fractures were growing wider, not just between systems, inside the Jedi Order itself. Some masters spoke in absolutes, some argued for war, others whispered doubts behind closed doors. Kit watched, listened, and said little, but he saw how fast certainty was replacing compassion. He felt it in the way missions were assigned, in the way younger Jedi stopped asking questions. He taught at the temple when he could, not through lectures, through presence. He would spar with younglings, train with Padawans, not to show them how to win, but how to slow down, to wait for their opponent to breathe, to sense their emotion before striking, to ask themselves why they were holding a weapon in the first place. Some didn't understand, some did. One day, Master Windu asked him why he spent so much time with initiates when the galaxy needed him elsewhere. Kit just smiled, because they were still listening. Balance wasn't just between the Jedi and the Sith. It was instead just between war and diplomacy. It was between memory and direction, between the pain the Order had inherited and the future it was too distracted to shape. Kit didn't see himself as a guide, but he knew what it felt like to forget why you joined the Jedi in the first place. And he refused to forget. On Denon, he stopped a planetary coup by forcing both sides to eat dinner at the same table, literally. No weapons, no armor, just a meal. When the talks failed, he tried again. And again. Until someone finally listened. Because he didn't treat them like enemies. He treated them like people trapped in a galaxy that no longer gave them time to breathe. Kit Fisto couldn't save the Republic. He couldn't seal the fractures. But he could remind those around him what it felt like to stand in balance, even when the ground beneath them was already cracking apart. Every Jedi carried something unseen. For some it was anger buried beneath obedience. For others it was grief they never had time to feel. But for Kit Fisto, it was the weight of steadiness, the quiet expectation that he would always be composed. Even when others faltered, even when others broke. He began to notice it in briefings. When voices rose, they turned to him. When plans stalled, they looked to him. And when missions ended in silence, no one asked how he felt, only what came next. Because Kit never lost control. Not in battle, not in diplomacy, not even when the war crept closer with every passing rotation. But inside, he knew something was shifting. He started waking up earlier than necessary, meditating longer than usual, spending more time alone, walking the temple halls long after the sun had set. Not because he was seeking clarity, because he was holding something in, something he hadn't named yet. There was one night he didn't forget. He was called to escort a senator back from a disputed border system. The flight was quiet. The stars outside the viewport seemed unusually sharp. The senator was young, idealistic. She spoke for hours about reform, policy, systems that could still be saved. Then she asked him a question. "Do you think we're still winning?" Kit didn't answer right away. He looked at her and smiled. But that smile didn't reach his eyes. Later, when she had fallen asleep in her seat, he whispered a truth he hadn't said aloud before. "I think we're trying to win something that no longer wants to exist." He didn't tell the council, didn't write it in a report, but the words stayed with him. The Jedi were still fighting, still pushing, still intervening, still holding the line, but the galaxy had changed around them. The rules had shifted, and no one had told them. Kit felt it most when he returned from missions. The temple felt colder, less certain. Fewer masters smiled back. More students looked tired. Even the archive seemed quieter, not in volume but in presence. He began taking missions with younger Jedi, letting them lead where he could, teaching not through commands, but through example. But he didn't grow close to many, not out of pride, out of self-preservation. Because Kit had learned something few others had time to realize. When you're the one who never loses control, people forget that you still bleed. He remembered the names of every trooper who had died under his watch. Every village that fell before he could reach it. Every person he'd saved, and the ones he hadn't. And still, he smiled. Because that sets what steadiness required. Not a mask, a choice. One that he made again and again. Until even he forgot what he looked like without it. There were moments, though, brief, flickering moments, where it slipped. After a mission on Malastare where civilians had been caught between Republic tanks and Separatist mines, he stayed behind to help dig out the bodies. A clone captain asked if he wanted to be relieved. Kit shook his head and said they weren't such part of the plan, but they were still part of the story. No one replied. No one had to, because everyone around him had begun to understand what he carried, and they let him carry it. Until one day, someone wouldn't sut. But that day hadn't come yet. So Kit Fisto kept moving, kept serving, kept smiling, even as the war approached, even as the Order began to forget who they were trying to protect, even as the galaxy prepared to fall apart. Because until the very end, someone had to be the steady hands. Even if they were shaking when no one was looking. The Jedi Council chamber was designed to look outward. Glass walls curved toward the sky, offering a perfect view of Coruscant's endless cityscape. The sun rose there, the stars gathered there. 1,000 decisions had been made behind those windows, but the illusion remained that from this height one could see clearly. Kit Fisto never believed that. When he was offered a seat, he accepted it with quiet hesitation. Not from doubt, from understanding. The council didn't need another voice demanding answers. It needed someone who knew how to listen when the galaxy didn't make sense. He didn't speak during his first sessions, not because he had nothing to say, because he knew the words weren't ready yet. There were debates about deployment routes, security oversight, the slow rise of separatist sentiments in systems that once swore loyalty to the Republic. Some masters were rigid, some cautious, some already tired. Kit watched them all. He didn't offer solutions, he asked questions no one else had thought to ask. How long can peace survive if no one believes in it anymore? He never raised his voice, never interrupted. But when he did speak, the room always fell quiet. Because his calm wasn't passive, it was deliberate. And that kind of calm made others feel their own weight more clearly. Even Mace Windu, sharp, efficient, bound by the code, gave space when Kit offered perspective, and Yoda, whose presence could fill the chamber with silence alone, once said that Kit's mind moved like water, slow at first, but shaping stone over time. Still, Kit never saw the council as a place of honor. It was a responsibility, and a fragile one. He would meditate in his chamber longer after each meeting, trying to center himself not from conflict but from doubt. Because something beneath the surface was shifting, and the Force didn't whisper like it once had. It trembled. Small things, faint ripples. Reports from Jedi returning half-formed. Assignments given too quickly, based on political urgency rather than moral clarity. Clones appearing in secret orders, their creation unvoted, their purpose assumed. Kit asked about them. No one gave clear answers. Some said the Senate had approved it, others that Master Sifo-Dyas had foreseen the need. But when Kit reached into the Force for truth, he found nothing. Just static, like a signal jammed mid-transmission. He spoke with Plo Koon once, just before a full council session. The two had always shared quiet trust, warriors shaped not by power but by presence. Klaus asked him what he sensed about the coming storm. Kit replied, "It sets not coming, it sets already here." Neither of them smiled, because by then systems were already falling. Jedi were being pulled from meditation halls into war rooms, and the council began to shift. No longer just stewards of balance, now strategists, generals, political advisors. The lines were blurring, and Kit, who never sought power, now sat among those being asked to wield it. He watched younger knights burn out after a single campaign, watched Padawans train with live fire instead of calm breath, watched the Senate pass emergency powers like gifts handed to a desperate child. And all the while, he kept listening. Because someone had to. Someone had to remember what the council had once been, a circle, not a stage. A place to share silence, not to fill it with fear. Kit didn't resist the tide, he moved with it, adapted. But he kept one thing intact, his presence. When he walked into a room, people still paused. Not because of rank, because they remembered that feeling, the calm that didn't demand control, but offered steadiness. He wasn't trying to win the war. He was trying not to lose the Jedi inside it. And even as the war crept closer, even as the council's windows looked down on ships preparing for battle, instead of stars drifting in peace, Kit Fisto sat with his hands still, watching, waiting, listening, not to decide what came next, but to hear the moment the galaxy would no longer ask for peace, and begin demanding something darker. The Jedi had always served the Republic. It was a truth repeated across generations, through scripture, through ceremony, through quiet oaths spoken in childhood. But now that truth was beginning to feel like a question, one that echoed in Kit Fisto's mind more often than he admitted. He never spoke against the war publicly, never raised alarm in the council chamber. But in private moments, during long hyperspace jumps, in the stillness between missions, he wondered if the Order had wandered too far from the edge of its own shadow. The Jedi were guardians of peace, but peace had become a rumor. The council met more frequently now, and always under pressure, reports flooded in daily. Systems defecting, clones being moved like game pieces, Republic officers demanding Jedi presence to stabilize situations that no longer had anything to do with balance. Kit listened. He watched as old friends like Ki-Adi-Mundi argued for aggressive intervention, not out of cruelty, but out of fear that the war would spiral beyond control if they hesitated. He saw Mace Windu wrestle silently with his own discomfort, always measured, always composed, but with less certainty in his voice than before. And he saw Yoda grow quieter, not because he didn't sense what was happening, but because he sensed too much. There were missions where Jedi were deployed not to defend, but to control, to oversee planetary votes, to pressure governors. Kit received one such assignment himself, a request to oversee a disputed election on Arcanis. He declined. He didn't set lie. He didn't set protest. He simply said, "This is not where my voice belongs." No one challenged him. They simply reassigned the mission. But that moment stayed with him, not because of what he refused to do, but because of how easily they accepted it. As if even the council knew that their hands were touching too much power, too quickly. There was another moment, a quiet conversation with Master Depar Bilaba, just days before her own deployment to Harun Kal. She was tired, focused, but there was something behind her eyes, something that hadn't been there before. "Do you ever wonder," she asked, "if the council is no longer the council?" Kit didn't answer right away. Then he said, "It is, but it sits forgetting." She nodded. Neither of them spoke after that. She left the next morning. He never saw her again. The Order was changing. Kit could feel it in the way younglings walked the halls, with less curiosity, more urgency. He could feel it in the silence of the temple archives, where fewer students came to study and more came to prepare for their next mission. He could feel it in the way even he had begun choosing missions based not on need, but on where he might be able to preserve something before it vanished. He tried not to drift from the code. He meditated longer, spoke with the clones more often, observed the systems he visited with a diplomat's eyes, not a general's. But every passing cycle brought more orders, more lines to hold, more Jedi sent into conflicts that had no resolution. The Republic was calling louder, and the Jedi were answering faster. And loyalty, once so clear, now flickered like a damaged beacon. Kit wasn't disloyal, but his loyalty was no longer blind. He had begun to see the distinction between the Republic's needs and the Jedi's purpose, and while they still overlapped, they were no longer the same. He didn't speak these thoughts aloud, not yet, but he began writing them. Small reflections, lines recorded in his private logs, never distributed, never shared. Lines like, "Peacekeeping becomes control when fear drives the hand that offers it." Or, "The Jedi teach that darkness is to be resisted, but what if darkness wears the robes of urgency?" They were not accusations. They were reminders to himself. Because Kit knew that once a Jedi stopped reflecting, they started reacting. And once they started reacting, they stopped choosing. And once they stopped choosing, someone else would choose for them. The council still met, still spoke of justice, still stood in the circle that had guided the galaxy for 1,000 years. But beneath that circle, something had shifted. And Kit Fisto, seated near the edge, could feel it, a slow, silent cracking in the foundation beneath their feet. And though his voice remained soft, he was beginning to wonder how long silence could hold back the storm. The war began without a vote, not in the Senate, not in the Jedi Temple. It began on Geonosis, when blades were drawn in the dust of an arena, and hundreds of Jedi peacekeepers, negotiators, teachers, became soldiers in the span of a single hour. Kit Fisto was there. He remembered the sand, the heat, the moment the doors opened and the Jedi stepped into the sun like shadows made real. He remembered how quickly form became instinct, how fast negotiation turned into survival, and how loud the war felt once it had a name. The Clone Wars. It spread like fire, faster than the Order could adjust, faster than the Council could question, planets burning, systems breaking, allies turning into enemies overnight. The Jedi didn't want the war, but they led it anyway. Kit was given a command post before he asked for one. Troopers were assigned to him, briefings sent, campaigns outlined, ships requisitioned in his name. He accepted it, because turning it down wouldn't stop it. And the clones, the men under his command, needed a Jedi who didn't see them as numbers. So he served with them. He learned their names, not just ranks. He trained beside them, sat with them between missions, asked about their thoughts, their fears, not as a general, as a brother. Many didn't know what to say. No one had asked them before. He watched them bleed, watched them die, not for glory, not for choice, but because they were created to. And Kit was created to protect life. Even now, he couldn't reconcile the two truths. He fought battles on Christophsis, on Ryloth, on Dantooine. He held positions long after reinforcements failed to arrive. He brought his troops back alive more often than not, because he never treated the war like a chance to win. He treated it like a chance to delay something worse. But he saw what it was doing to the Order. Young Jedi promoted too fast, Padawans trained on battlefields, knights stripped of reflection, thrown into campaign after campaign with no time to ask why. And the Council, once the galaxy's moral compass, was now a war council. He watched the way Obi-Wan Kenobi's voice grew heavier with each loss. He watched the way Anakin Skywalker walked through halls like a weapon no one could sheath. He watched Aayla Secura get quieter, more direct, less willing to linger between orders. And Kit remained steady. Because someone had to. But the smile, the one that had calmed blasters in his early days, was harder to find now. Not because he had lost hope, but because hope had stopped being enough. He tried to find peace in the moments between, taught former to younglings who still had time to learn, visited the temple gardens when planets allowed a return, spoke with Plo Koon about how to hold compassion in the midst of loss. They were still Jedi. But it was harder to remember what that meant when your boots were always covered in ash. One day, during a campaign on Fourleen, a young commander asked him, "Master Fisto, do you believe we stir doing the right thing?" Kit didn't answer immediately. He looked at the boy, no older than 17, already scarred, already tired. Then he said, "We sir doing the best we can with something we didn't said choose." It wasn't said comfort, but it was honest. He didn't speak of it in the council chambers, because no one asked. The war didn't leave room for doubts, only action. And that silence, more than anything, haunted him. Because if the Jedi couldn't ask whether they were still Jedi, who would? Kit kept moving, kept leading, kept shielding his men when orders got too cold, too distant, too political. But part of him knew. This war, this path, was never theirs to begin with. They were walking someone else's road, and the destination was getting darker with every step. The council chamber was quieter now. Meetings still happened, votes were still cast, but the energy had changed. Where once there had been shared meditation, now there were shared doubts, spoken only in glances, in pauses, in the way Yoda would close his eyes before speaking, in the way Windu would sit a little longer after sessions ended. Kit Fisto remained present. He rarely led the discussions, but when he did speak, his voice felt like still water. And still, it wasn't enough to slow the current. There were rumors now, whispers of the Chancellor's extended powers, of closed-door meetings between Palpatine and key Jedi, of surveillance orders passed without council consensus. Every time they tried to ask, the answers came late, or not at all. And still, the Jedi obeyed. Kit began to realize something simple and terrifying. The Republic no longer trusted the Jedi, and the Jedi no longer trusted themselves. He remembered a night, late in the cycle, after a long debrief from a failed campaign on Skako Minor. The room had cleared. Only he and Master Shark T remained. She had lost many men that week, and when she spoke, her voice was distant. "We were trained to feel disturbance in the Force," she said. Kit nodded. "But what if the Force itself is disturbed, and we are the ones ignoring it?" He said nothing, because he had thought the same. The Jedi still moved forward, still served, still planned, but their actions felt thinner, more mechanical, less rooted. The connection that once held everything together now felt frayed, like a transmission caught in static. Kit tried to meditate on it, to reach for answers. But the Force, which had once flowed through him like the ocean, now responded like mist. Present, but unreachable. He began spending less time in the temple and more in the field, not to fight, to feel, to walk the ground, to speak with people the war had swallowed, farmers, engineers, children too young to understand why cities burned. He listened more than he spoke, and he heard things the council never discussed. Planets were choosing neutrality, not because they hated the Republic, because they no longer understood what it was protecting. Even loyal systems were growing quiet, waiting, watching. Something was coming, but it had no name yet. In the final cycles before everything broke, Kit had a vision. He didn't speak of it, didn't record it. He was meditating aboard a cruiser between deployments when the image came, not with clarity, but with weight. The council chamber, empty. The windows cracked, the chairs toppled, and one lightsaber still glowing green. He didn't sit wake in fear. He sat in silence for hours after, not because he feared death, because he feared becoming the last voice in a room that had stopped listening. That's what the war had done. It hadn't turned the Jedi into monsters. It had made them quiet, too quiet. And Kit Fisto, the steady one, the smiling one, began to feel something he never had before. Urgency. Not to act recklessly, but to stop assuming time would offer answers. The council had always believed in patience, but now patience was starting to look like permission. So Kit began preparing. He trained harder, moved faster, watched the Chancellor set's movements more closely. He didn't trust him. Not openly. Not yet. But the way Palpatine moved through the war, the way he never bent, never hesitated, reminded Kit of something he'd seen long ago in the eyes of desperate men. Conviction that refused to be questioned. And conviction without reflection was something far more dangerous than rage. Still, Kit said nothing, because saying it aloud meant admitting that the war had already reached the temple, not through armies, but through silence. And so he waited, watched, listened, because even when no one else would say it, he would be ready for the moment when silence was no longer safe, when silence became a warning, and when that warning turned into a final choice between loyalty and what was left of the Jedi. The sky over Kamino was always gray. It didn't shift, it didn't break, it didn't clear. The storms were constant, as if the ocean had risen into the clouds and refused to return. For those stationed there, time didn't pass, it drowned. Kit Fisto stood on one of the outer platforms the moment the first separatist ships entered orbit. He didn't speak, he didn't move. He just listened. The water was uneasy. He could feel it in the vibration under the durasteel, in the pull of the tide beneath the platform, in the way the wind hit the back of his neck, like something was about to snap. He turned to the clone officer beside him. Sound the alarm. Within seconds, the Kaminoan structures lit up with warning lights. Sirens that hadn't been tested in months began to wail. RC troopers ran toward the launch bays, submersible units deployed from the lower levels. And above it all, the clouds tore open. Separatist cruisers descended like black teeth from a dark mouth, and dropships rained down into the waves, not onto land, into the ocean itself. The attack was coordinated. They weren't set just targeting the facilities. They were targeting the life below them, the life being grown, conditioned, shaped for a war that none of them had chosen. Kit drew his saber and dove into the sea. The water closed around him like memory, cold, familiar, endless. He moved through it like he was home, because in a way he was. The currents didn't resist him. They carried him. The force flowed clearer here, unbothered by cities or Senate votes or battle plans. But there was no peace in it now. The enemy had come to erase what the Republic had hidden. Droid subs cut through the dark water, long and fast, their lights flickering like predator eyes. Kit moved between them, not as a shield, as a blade. He disabled the first with a single slash. The second spun out in a cloud of bubbles. But there were more. He reached the main hatch of the lower structure and sealed it just as the outer wall shuddered. Explosions bloomed in the deep, red light against blue stillness. Behind him, troopers braced for breach. They didn't speak, they never did. But Kit looked at them, not their armor, their eyes, and felt something settle in his chest. They weren't set afraid. Not of death, only of failure. And that made the air heavier than water. The breach came 5 minutes later. Droids forced the seal. Kit met them head-on, blade ignited, breath steady. Underwater combat wasn't set like fighting on land. There was no rhythm, only reaction, no momentum, only movement. And Kit moved like he wasn't bound by gravity or fear. His saber cut through the dark like a pulse, and for a moment, just a moment, the corridor filled with light. He didn't speak, but the clones followed, room by room, floodgate by floodgate, until the lower levels were sealed again. But the damage wasn't set just structural. As Kit walked through the half-submerged corridors, he saw something that stayed with him far longer than any scar. Rows of chambers, not destroyed, not targeted, opened, empty. The Separatists hadn't said come to kill clones. They had come to erase the future. And in doing so, they reminded Kit of something he had tried to forget. These weren't set soldiers being created. They were sons. And no one had asked them if they wanted to be born. The next wave didn't come from above. It came from below. After the lower corridors were secured, the scanners went dark, not from jamming but from absence. Kit knew what that meant. Something had passed beneath the sensors without leaving a trace. He stood with Commander Monk, a clone who had trained alongside some of the earliest ARC units. Monk was steady, sharp, older than most. He didn't wait for orders. "They're coming through the old filtration shafts," he said. Kit didn't ask how he knew. He just nodded. They moved fast, not in panic, but in rhythm. Kit took point. The shafts were narrow, designed for water, not war. But war didn't set at care where it belonged. When the breach came, it was sudden. The first droid burst through a corroded panel and fired at close range. The bolt missed Kit by centimeters, but hit the clone behind him. He didn't scream. He just fell. Kit reacted with speed that didn't feel like thought. His saber snapped upward, cutting the droid in half, and then he moved into the shaft, into the tight metal crawl where every movement had to be chosen with precision. The battle that followed wasn't set elegant. It wasn't set cinematic. It was personal. Up close, too close. Blades against metal. Bolts fired blind in narrow spaces. Screams that didn't set echo, just ended. Kit fought like water. Yes, fluid, instinctive, but what no one ever said was that water cuts slowly. It surrounds, smothers, and it never retreats unless forced. He didn't set retreat. When the final shaft was cleared, 6 clones were down, one still breathing. Barely. Kit pulled him out himself, carried him back to the medbay as the others secured the line. No one stopped to ask about casualties. There was no time. The next alert came minutes later. Upper deck breached. South Tower under siege. The cloning chambers compromised. Kit looked at Monk. "I shall go," he said. But Monk stopped him. "Sir," he said, "if they reach the embryos..." "I know." Kit didn't wait. The South Tower was chaos. Fire, steam, flooded platforms, sniper fire from above. And Kaminoan scientists, tall, elegant, terrified, trying to hold on to data that could rewrite the future of the war. Kit moved through it like a second storm. Not wild, directed. He deflected sniper bolts without needing to see them, redirected fire to clear safe lanes for med teams. He used his saber not just as a weapon, as a signal to tell his men where to move, when to breathe, where not to die. And they followed. Not because he was Jedi, because he didn't treat them like they were built for this. He treated them like they had a choice. And in that chaos, choice meant everything. The fighting dragged on for hours. By nightfall, though no sun ever shone on Kamino, the Separatists began to retreat. Their subs failed to breach the core. Their assault teams fell back. The skies were scorched, but held. Kamino stood. But Kit didn't feel victory. He stood on the edge of the command platform, soaked in rain and salt and blood, not all of it his. and looked out over the sea. His men were cheering. They had won. But Kit felt none of it. Because for the first time, he had seen the war reach a place where no war should ever go, into the chambers where life begins. And what he saw there couldn't be fought with a lightsaber. The Republic had created soldiers in silence, and now the silence was fighting back. After the battle, the air inside Tipoca City felt thinner. Not because of pressure loss, because of what had been exposed. Kit stayed behind while most of the command teams rotated out. He wasn't ordered to. He chose to. He wanted to see what remained, not the debris, the process. He requested access to the lower cloning rings. The Kaminoans didn't resist. They just watched him. Like a variable they didn't account for. He walked through halls lined with growth chambers, some intact, others shattered. Inside, rows of identical faces floated in fluid, their eyes closed, their lives not yet begun. He moved slowly. Past adolescent clone squads in silent drills, past the nutrient labs where bodies were calibrated like starship parts. He paused at one of the glass chambers, hand resting lightly on the cold surface. The boy inside couldn't have been more than 6, not mentally, not emotionally, just growing. Flesh formed from a blueprint, a future already written. And Kit asked himself a question he didn't yet have the strength to voice. Who gave us the right? He had fought beside these men, bled with them, trusted them, but this was different. This wasn't set war. This was manufacturing. And what struck him hardest was instead the scale. It was the silence. There was no emotion in the Kaminoans' voices as they calibrated systems that would determine height, strength, obedience. No ceremony, no grief, just process. As if life was only valuable once it could hold a weapon. Kit spoke with one of the science leaders, a Kaminoan named Ton Rald, clinical, precise. He asked her how many units had been lost in the attack. She gave a number, then added, repairs to the development line are already underway. Not recovery. Repairs. He asked what would happen to the unfinished embryos damaged in the breach. She said they'd be terminated and recycled. And Kit felt something twist in his chest. Because this wasn't set malice. It wasn't set evil. It was efficiency. And that made it harder to fight. He walked the perimeter alone that evening. The rain was gentler now. Monch joined him, helmet off. They didn't speak for a long time. Then Monch said, "We Sith are not supposed to think about it, what we came from." Kit looked at him. "But you do." Monch nodded. "All of us do. We just don't talk about it." Kit sat down on the edge of the platform. The ocean spread out in every direction. Monch sat beside him. He asked a question few Jedi would have dared. "Do you ever wish it had been different?" Kit answered without delay. "Yes." And then he added, "But wishing doesn't mean I don't still trust you." Mon didn't look surprised. He just said, "That sets more than most." The clones weren't set unaware. They knew what they were made for. But they also knew who treated them like men and who didn't. Kit stayed on Kamino 3 days after the battle. He helped oversee the transfer of wounded troopers. He visited the memorial wall, not official, just names written in marker on one of the dormitory panels. He read every one. And when he left, he took nothing with him. Except a memory. Of a place where life was made, used and replaced. And of brothers who never asked for a war. Only for time. Time to choose who they could have been, if anyone had let them. The rain never stopped on Kamino. Even as Kit prepared to leave, it fell with the same quiet rhythm, soft, endless, indifferent. The battle was over. The systems were back online. The Kaminoans had resumed production. clones were already returning to routine drills, checks, formations. It was as if the attack had been a momentary pause in a process that was never meant to feel. But Kit felt more than before. Something had shifted inside him. He stood by the landing platform, hood pulled low, waiting for the transport to arrive. His boots were still damp from walking the lower halls. The wind brushed against him like memory. He didn't yet want to go, not because he felt needed, because he wasn't set ready to forget what he set seen. Behind him, Monk approached. The clone commander held a small datapad, blank, except for a list of names, lost troopers, the ones not returning, not just from the battle, but from the cloning lines that never made it to birth. Monk offered it without a word. Kit didn't take it. He only looked at it for a long time, and then said, "Donsti erase them." Monk nodded once, then walked away. Kit had seen war on many worlds, but Kamino wasn't a battlefield. It was a mirror. It showed the Republic what it had built when it stopped asking questions. It showed the Jedi what they were standing on, and it showed Kit something he hadn't expected to face yet. The edge of his calm. He had always been the steady one, the one who didn't lose focus, who found clarity in chaos. But here, surrounded by engineered life, by systems that measured value in usefulness, his calm had been tested. And though it didn't break, it cracked. In the silence of the cloning chambers, in the look of a boy not yet old enough to speak, already trained to obey, in the way the Jedi never talked about the clones as if they might outlive the war. Kit returned to the temple, but something followed him. He noticed it during meditation. A pause, a hesitation. Not fear, not guilt, grief. Grief for a generation grown in silence. Grief for a mission the Jedi never questioned deeply enough. Grief for himself, for the parts of his belief that no longer aligned cleanly with the world he was serving. He met with the Council upon his return. They asked for a tactical report. He gave it. They asked for losses. He gave the numbers. No one asked what he had felt. And Kit didn't volunteer it. Because even now, even with everything he had seen, he was still a Jedi. But the part of him that once saw the Republic and the Order as unshakable foundations had learned something harder. Even foundations erode if no one checks the ground beneath them. And on Kamino that ground wasn't set solid. It was water, moving, shifting, capable of holding you up or pulling you under. Kit knew now that the war wasn't just being fought in systems or cities. It was being fought in silence, in memory, in the hearts of Jedi who didn't know if they were still protectors or products. And he knew too that the cracks inside him wouldn't close, not with meditation, not with time, because they weren't set weaknesses, they were warnings. And Kit Fisto would carry them forward, quietly, like all the truths no one wanted to say out loud. Until the day came when silence would no longer be enough. Grievous didn't speak like a machine when they first met. He was already more metal than flesh by then, already hunted, already feared, but there was something in his voice that hadn't yet broken into static, a bitterness that sounded almost human. Kit recognized it immediately, not because he agreed with it, but because he had felt it before, the bitterness of being used. It wasn't during a duel, it was during a standstill. A brief ceasefire on Coruscant had pulled multiple fronts into pause. Wounded were being moved. Clone officers were regrouping, and Grievous stood across a shattered ridge, flanked by Magna Guards, staring at Kit Fisto with something different in his eyes. Not rage, not contempt, but calculation, as if he was trying to understand him, and for a moment Kit allowed the same. The Jedi rarely spoke about these moments. It felt disloyal to admit that your enemy wasn't always a monster. But Kit had learned that clarity didn't come from retreating into rules. It came from listening, even when it was dangerous. Grievous sent a message across the field that day. A private channel opened, encrypted. Kit accepted it without hesitation. "You are not like the others," Grievous had said. "You smile in war. You do not carry fear the same way." Kit replied simply, "I still feel it." The channel went silent. Then Grievous said something few would ever believe. "They built me to carry fear." It wasn't a truce, it wasn't understanding, but it was something close to recognition. A fleeting moment when both saw the battlefield not as victory or failure, but as something done to them. They would clash again days later. No more channels, no more distance, just blades, metal, movement. Kit remembered the weight of Grievous's strikes, not heavy like a brute, but deliberate, rehearsed. There was intelligence buried beneath the chaos. He had trained with Jedi once, stolen lightsabers, studied their forms, but something was always off, too fast, too mechanical. Kit could read living opponents. He could feel their hesitation, their anger, their fear. Grievous had none of it. And yet, Kit could feel the echo of a man. Maybe that's what made him so dangerous. Not just the body, not just the weapons, but that trace of what he used to be. Grievous was a lesson the Jedi didn't want to study, a being twisted by war, stripped of purpose, and turned into a tool. He hated the Jedi not because he truly knew them, but because someone had told him what they were. And Kit couldn't shake the thought, was that so different from the clones? He had heard Obi-Wan's warnings about attachment. He respected them. But Kit had always struggled with how easily the Jedi gave themselves to systems, to battles, to governments, to causes that shifted under their feet. His own men, the clones he led, had names, laughed, lived, and he knew someday they would be ordered to die, or worse, ordered to kill. So when he met Grievous again, later, on Vasek, Kit was already carrying questions. Questions about what loyalty really meant, about what the war was asking them to become. The Council still called Grievous a monster. Most of the Republic did, and in many ways he was, but monsters aren't born, they're made. And Kit Fisto had seen the factory. He had seen the Camino halls where life was shaped for obedience. He had seen the eyes of his troops, sharp, alert, loyal, and wondered if that was truly what freedom looked like. Maybe that sits why he hesitated more than others. He didn't strike first. He didn't rush his decisions, not because he was slow, but because he had learned speed and clarity are not the same. Grievous was not just the Separatists' general. He was a mirror, one the Republic refused to look into. But Kit did, and every time he did, he felt something shift inside. Not weakness, not doubt. Something harder to carry. Memory. The compound was carved into stone like a forgotten ruin. Vasek was quiet when they landed. Too quiet. The wind didn't move. The water around the cliffs held its breath. Kit Fisto stepped off the ship with a calm he had learned to wear like armor. But Nada Veb was not calm. The young Mon Calamari moved like he had something to prove, and maybe he did. It was his first real mission since becoming a knight. He carried his lightsaber higher than needed, his stance too sharp, too ready. Kit didn't scold him for it. He remembered what that edge felt like, the mix of fear and pride, of wanting to serve and be seen at the same time. Inside the fortress, the silence continued. Droids lay scattered in strange places, deactivated. The halls weren't guarded. It felt abandoned, but not dead. There was something watching, not from cameras, from the walls themselves, as if the place had been built to hold a memory. Nada wanted to press forward fast. Kit slowed him down. "Let the quiet tell you something," he said. But Nada didn't want quiet. He wanted confrontation. They eventually found Grievous, or rather he revealed himself, not as a general in battle, but as a host in a tomb. The lair was his retreat, not his base, a place to repair, to plan, to remember. Kit realized quickly, this wasn't just a tactical mission, it was personal, for Grievous, for Nada, for him. There were trophies here, not banners or medals, bones, pieces of Jedi armor, marks of old battles. Kit felt the pull of the past in every corridor. This was where Grievous came to pretend he wasn't hunted, to pretend he still had control. He emerged from the shadows like a wound refusing to close. The duel didn't start with words, just movement, sharp, practiced. Kit defended with precision. He didn't need to win. He just needed to survive long enough to understand what this place truly was. Nadar fought like a firecracker, explosive, unchecked, and Grievous mocked him for it. "You sit not ready," he snarled. "Your anger smells like smoke." Kit tried to pull him back, but Veb didn't listen. And Grievous knew how to feed that kind of fire. The Magna Guards moved in. Kit held his ground, blades spinning, steps smooth. He fought not with rage, but with rhythm, like a tide refusing to retreat. Still, it wasn't enough to hold Nadar. He broke formation, charged Grievous alone. The mistake was instant and irreversible. Grievous stabbed him through the chest, not quick, not clean. He looked into Nadar's eyes as he did it. Kit shouted his name, too late. He could have run. He didn't. He stood his ground and stared down the machine that had just killed his Padawan. And for a moment, something passed between them again, not respect, not victory, just the echo of understanding. "You train them to die," Grievous said. "I was trained to kill." Kit didn't answer. He couldn't set. The lair was collapsing now. Grievous fled, vanishing into fire and smoke. Kit escaped with what was left of his team, and with the weight of what had just happened. He had lost students before. Jedi lived with that risk, but this one felt different, because it hadn't been necessary, because he had seen it coming, and because part of him wondered, had he been too slow to stop it, or too afraid to break the Council's rules and command Nadar differently. The lair of Grievous wasn't just a battlefield, it was a mirror again. A place that showed the Jedi what they were becoming, and what they were losing. Kit sat alone in the ship's hold, the hum of hyperspace around him, but silence inside. Nadar's body lay behind a sealed panel, wrapped in the same robe he'd once been so eager to wear. Jedi didn't grieve like others, but that didn't mean the loss didn't stay. Kit stared at the floor for a long time, then at his hands, the same hands that had deflected Grievous's blades, held back a Magna Guard, but failed to reach a student in time. He didn't blame Nadar. The boy had spirit. That was never the problem. The problem was the war had changed the measure of what Jedi spirit looked like. Nadar had grown up seeing clones call them general, had watched Jedi lead charges, not meditations. He wanted to protect people, but also to prove something, that he was worthy of the Jedi name. And that need, the need to prove. It was poison, gentle at first, almost invisible. Kit remembered when that poison had first touched the Order, long before Geonosis, even before Naboo. It crept in slowly, in how the Council met with senators more than sages, in how Jedi missions began to reflect Republic interests more than the Force's will. He remembered Yoda's eyes narrowing when speaking of the dark side. But darkness didn't always come as rage, sometimes it arrived as pride. That was what Kit feared now. Not Grievous, not Dooku, not even Sidious, though he didn't yet know that name. He feared the pride of young Jedi, who thought lightsabers could fix a galaxy cracking at the seams. Nadar's death wasn't the result of error. It was the result of momentum, of choices made by people far above them, of wars started before he was even a Padawan. Still, Kit carried the weight. He requested a private burial, no clone ceremony, no Republic record. He took Nadar's body to a quiet moon in the Karkarodon system. The cliffs there resembled coral, and the wind sounded like Mon Cala currents. Kit stood over the grave for hours, saying nothing, just listening. He left no marker, only a thought. May your path return to the current. That night, as he meditated in orbit, he felt something strange, a flicker in the Force, like Nadar's voice, but distant, not sorrow, not pain. Stillness. Kit took that as the boy's final lesson. Not every death is wasted, but every loss demands reflection. When he returned to Coruscant, the Council received him with respect but little discussion. Mace Windu asked one question: was the mission worth it? Kit gave the only answer he could: no. And that was it. The war went on. Missions stacked like stones. Jedi kept dying. The clone factories kept producing. But something inside Kit had changed. He no longer believed the Council saw the full shape of what was happening. He no longer believed this was just a war. He started training fewer students, took fewer assignments. He sat longer in the meditation chambers, not for peace, but for clarity, listening not to the Republic, but to the Force. The others didn't dare question him, but they noticed. Kit smiled less, spoke less, moved like a man who had seen what was coming but couldn't stop it. And maybe that was true. The Jedi weren't set falling yet, but the cracks had reached their foundation. Kamino wasn't quiet after the battle. It never was. The rain never stopped. The cloning chambers never paused. Life kept being made, for war, not for peace. Kit Fisto stood on one of the upper platforms overlooking the deep water. Behind him, waves crashed against the Durasteel pylons. Below, millions of cloned lives waited for deployment. He didn't see soldiers, he saw children. Not in their size or their speech, but in what they lacked: choice. Each trooper bore the face of Jango Fett, but none of them bore the freedom of their original. They were born for obedience, conditioned for loyalty, and engineered to fight and die, again and again, for a republic that had forgotten why it existed. Kit had walked among them, taught them combat stances, joked with the commanders, praised their efficiency. But after Nadar, it didn't feel like camaraderie. It felt like a lie. He remembered the tanks where they floated, arms folded across their chests, eyes closed, like unborn ghosts. He remembered a young trooper looking up at him and asking, "Do Jedi go back in the tube when they die?" It wasn't a joke. The boy genuinely didn't know what death looked like for anyone else. Kit gave him no answer. He couldn't sit. He thought about the Kaminoans, tall, graceful, clinical. They spoke with pride about genetic accuracy, accelerated growth, programmed compliance. To them, these weren't people. They were tools, living spreadsheets. And the Jedi had agreed. Because the war made it easy to forget what made life sacred. In quiet moments, Kit found himself visiting the training chambers, not to observe drills, but to watch movement, to see if any clone blinked twice at a command, to see if one paused, hesitated, questioned. Most didn't dare, but a few did, and that's what haunted him. Those were the ones who, if born anywhere else in the galaxy, might have become Jedi, or healers, or artists, or just free. But here they would only know helmets and war zones. He once told Mace Windu that the clones were capable, brave, and loyal. Mace agreed, but Kit wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. Back on Mon Cala, children were taught that water remembers everything: the motion of a whale fin, the echo of a battle, even the sorrow of a single tear dropped from a cliff. Kit believed that now more than ever, Kamino's oceans, vast and unending, weren't just violent. They were witnesses to the birth of an army, to the loss of Jedi innocence, to the slow bleeding away of purpose. As the war stretched on, Kit began to distance himself from the things that once defined his role. He taught fewer classes, avoided council meetings when he could. He patrolled alone more often, not because he didn't trust others, but because he didn't trust the direction they were all moving in. The Force still spoke to him, but its voice was quieter, not out of anger, but out of distance. It was as if the Jedi had stepped too far from it, and now it waited for them to return on their own. On his final visit to Kamino before his next assignment, Kit took a moment by the outer platform one last time. A clone commander saluted him, awaiting orders. Kit just nodded. "Keep your men safe," he said softly. The commander nodded back, perhaps not realizing how rare it was for a Jedi to say that anymore. As Kit's ship rose from the platform, the water below churned, but the sky remained the same, dark, endless, echoing with the rhythm of rain. Some said the water on Kamino washed everything away. But Kit knew the truth. The water remembered. And someday, when the galaxy was quiet again, it would whisper the names of the ones lost, not just Jedi, not just heroes, but every soul built for a war they never asked for. The first time Kit Fisto stood in front of a clone unit, he didn't speak, he didn't need to. The soldiers were lined up in perfect rows, white armor gleaming, helmets forward, identical postures like statues made for war. They saluted in perfect timing. Not one of them blinked. And yet Kit felt something stir beneath the surface. It wasn't the Force, it was something quieter, something heavier. The Jedi had been taught to serve peacekeepers, not generals, yet here he was, assigned command, expected to lead lives into battle as if they were tactics on a board. The men before him weren't just numbers, he saw it instantly. Small shifts in stance, micro-reactions, some nervous, some eager, some already tired, all trained to hide what they felt. Kit wasn't sure if they even knew what they felt, not yet. He slowly walked down the line, boots pressing into Kamino's cold floor. His eyes scanned every helmet. He wondered what they looked like underneath. Not just their faces, he already knew they were identical. He meant what was behind the eyes. He meant the story no one would ever write down. One clone shifted slightly, only a half step off from the rest. It was barely noticeable, but Kit noticed. He stopped in front of the trooper, looked at the helmet and smiled, not out of amusement but out of human recognition. The clone didn't move. He didn't know what to do with the moment. It wasn't protocol. That night, Kit sat alone in a chamber the Kaminoans provided. He meditated, but his mind didn't wander far. It returned again and again to that formation. That silence, that sea of white helmets, each one hiding something no Jedi had ever prepared to witness, a soul built for someone else's war. He had read the briefings, he understood the strategy, but none of it felt real until he stood among them. These weren't just products of genetic engineering. They were men, breathing, waiting, hoping for purpose in a war they didn't choose. The Jedi called them clones. The Senate called them units. The Kaminoans called them inventory. But Kit called them brothers. He didn't say it aloud. He wasn't even sure when the word began forming in his mind. But he felt it, slowly growing each time he looked into their eyes, each time he saw one hesitate before battle, each time he heard them call him general, with voices they barely owned. He remembered how many Jedi never looked at the clones after giving them an order. Some didn't even use names. Others used nicknames that stripped them further of identity. Kit made a decision early. He would never lead them by title. He would learn their names, their voices, their quirks. He would speak to them before he spoke about them. There was something unnatural about the silence these men carried, not because they lacked thought, but because they had no place to put it. They were built to obey, not to reflect. Kit sensed that, and it disturbed him more than any Sith presence he had ever known. In the still hours between missions, he began sitting with them in the mess. No speeches, no orders, just presence. The clones didn't know what to make of it at first. Some avoided eye contact. Others sat stiffly, unsure if they were breaking some hidden rule. But Kit didn't push. He just sat there eating the same ration cubes, nodding at the same empty halls. Slowly something shifted. One of them, young, eager, too quick with his blaster, asked Kit about lightsabers. Another asked if the Jedi had families. A third didn't speak at all. He just kept watching Kit with the quiet stare of someone trying to remember how to feel something. Kit didn't have all the answers. He didn't even know what questions to ask yet, but he knew one thing. He had been trained to protect the galaxy. Now he had to protect the men no one else saw. They fought like Jedi, not in grace or style, but in spirit. That was what Kit Fisto saw every time he entered the battlefield with his men. They didn't move for glory. They didn't crave medals or recognition. They moved for each other. The clones learned fast, not just how to shoot or march, but how to think beyond their orders. Kit encouraged that. He never wanted soldiers who followed blindly. He wanted minds, eyes that could see what he couldn't, voices that could speak when something felt wrong. He believed that leadership wasn't about control, it was about trust. One mission, the orders were simple: secure a listening post on Rishi. The Republic wanted it done quietly. No collateral, no attention. The clones under Kit's command began to notice signs the intel was wrong. Patrol paths didn't line up. The landscape bore marks of heavier machinery than expected. One clone, Connecticut 3285, they called him Dre, suggested they were walking into a trap. He wasn't a strategist, he wasn't a Jedi, but Kit listened. The trap was real. Separatist droids had buried artillery under the surface, a silent net waiting to spring. Kit never reported who uncovered it. He didn't have to. He just looked at Dre before the first shot was fired, and nodded. That nod stayed with Dre until the day he died. Kit heard about it later, weeks after the battle on Felucia. Dre didn't make it out, but his last words were passed along through clone channels. He had told another trooper, "He listened to me once, that was enough." They weren't made to be mourned, at least not by the war machine that built them. When a clone died, another took his place. Same face, same voice. The galaxy never noticed, but Kit did. He kept track, not just of names, but moments, things that made each man different, even if their DNA never changed. He remembered how Trooper Bell would hum before battles. He said it calmed his nerves. Kit never told him it calmed his own too. He remembered how Sergeant Kale used to collect pieces of shrapnel from each battlefield, not as trophies but reminders, so I don't forget where we've been. Kale once said. Kit kept one of those shards after Kale fell on Christophus. He remembered how one of the younger troopers, maybe 19 standard years, once confessed he was afraid of water. Kit, a Nautolan, understood that in a way few others could. He never forced the boy onto aquatic missions again. These weren't droids, these weren't pawns, these were brothers, and with each battle, each funeral, that truth weighed heavier. Not every Jedi saw it, some refused to see it. There were those who still believed the clones were instruments of the Force, that their purpose was simply to serve, and nothing more. But Kit couldn't accept that. He saw too much, felt too much, felt too much. He saw how the Republic's gratitude was mechanical, a pat on the back, a number in a report, promotions with no peace, medals sent to empty barracks. He saw how some clones began to question things, not out loud, but in the way they paused when a command was given, the way they looked at fallen comrades, the way they stared too long at stars after battles, like they were trying to understand if this was all life would be. And he saw how the Jedi, even in all their wisdom, began hardening. Distance was forming, between master and soldier, between protector and tool. The Jedi Temple taught serenity, but the battlefield demanded detachment, and somewhere between those two lessons, humanity was fading. Kit Fisto never lost his smile, not on the surface, but in the quiet between wars when the helmets were off and the halls were still. He carried the weight of every clone who followed him without knowing why. Not because they believed in the cause, but because they believed in him. There was a shift Kit couldn't ignore, not in the battles, but in the silence between them, a sense that something was breaking down, quietly, under the surface of duty, the clones still followed commands. They still fought with precision, but the questions behind their eyes grew louder. He began to notice how fewer troopers asked why. Not because they had accepted the war, but because they were tired of not being heard. One mission took them to the Outer Rim, a jungle world unnamed in the archives. A small separatist base was suspected of developing biological weapons. The Republic wanted the site destroyed, no survivors, but when Kit's forces landed, they found children, not soldiers, not droids, just families hiding in fear. The orders were clear: eliminate the threat. The clones waited. They looked at him. No one moved. Kit gave a different command: pull back, secure the perimeter, scan for tech, leave the civilians alone. Later in the debrief, the council reprimanded him gently, reminded him that hesitation invites defeat, but the clones said nothing. They didn't cheer, they didn't thank him, they just stayed quiet, like something sacred had almost been broken and barely held together. Kit began to realize that the clones had their own code, not written in temples or etched in crystal, but built in the barracks, the trenches, the shared moments where one wrong call meant death. They didn't need speeches, they needed decisions that made sense, ones that didn't feel like betrayal. He remembered a battle on Original 7th. A fortified ridge had to be taken. Intel said light resistance. It wasn't. Half a battalion was lost before Kit could order a retreat. The survivors didn't blame him, but that night, a clone named Hex approached him. "Sir," he said, "we followed you up that ridge, not because it was smart, because we trusted you. We need to know next time that you shall trust us too." That line never left him. Kit had grown up in a system where trust flowed downward, from master to Padawan, from general to trooper. But in the war, he saw that real leadership flowed both ways. The Force moved through all life, and the clones, for all their engineered origins, were very much alive. They had jokes, habits, regrets, dreams they never voiced, because no one ever asked. He began spending more time without rank, sitting among them when they cleaned weapons, walking with them when they weren't on patrol, not as a Jedi, just as someone who understood how cold the galaxy could be when you were seen as disposable. Still, the war didn't wait for reflection. More missions came, more orders, less meaning. The Republic's commands grew sharper. Intelligence turned to surveillance, protection became preemption. And every time Kit questioned a directive, someone reminded him of loyalty. The clones didn't complain, but Kit noticed the way their conversations shortened, how their laughs grew quieter, how their questions became internal. Why are we still fighting? Who decides who the enemy is? What happens when there are no more separatists left? And beneath it all, the one question none of them could say aloud: what happens to us after? Kit wanted to believe the Jedi would protect them, that peace would come, and the Republic would honor those who bled for it. But with each new assignment, that belief began to feel like a story told to children, one meant to soften a truth too heavy for grown men to carry. The clones obeyed every command, but that didn't just mean they understood them. And Kit Fisto, who once thought clarity came from the Force alone, began to wonder if the Republic even knew what it was fighting for anymore. It was strange how often people spoke of Kit Fisto's smile. Even in the war, it followed him, like a signature carved into the haze of fire and loss. Commanders called it optimism, journalists called it charm, the clones called it steady. But the truth was simpler and heavier. It was armor. He smiled because someone had to, because hope needed a face, and in a war full of helmets and orders, his face became a symbol that things might still make sense. Even when they didn't set, Kit would wake from dreams, not of battlefields, but of corridors where every door led to silence, places where the Force felt thin, where the galaxy looked back at him with eyes that didn't blink. He told himself it was fatigue, stress, noise echoing too long in his mind. But the Force whispered something colder, that the war wasn't just changing the clones, it was changing him. He started noticing how quickly the line between choice and command blurred, how often missions were decided before the Council even met, how systems surrendered without hearing why they were targets in the first place. Kit had always believed in the Republic, believed in structure, purpose, unity. But now, he found himself staring at tactical briefings, wondering what piece of the map would be sacrificed next, which clone would not return, which command would require him to smile while sending someone into fire. He smiled through funerals. He smiled through Jedi arguments. He smiled when Nadar Veb died, not because he was numb, but because the clone beside him was still breathing, and Kit needed to be something to hold on to. His smile wasn't set happiness, it was duty, and that set's what made it dangerous. Because it hid the grief. There was a moment, small, unnoticed, that broke something inside him. After a raid on a separatist vault, Kit found a crate of memory chips, unmarked, encrypted. Inside were logs, clone memories, recorded without permission, data the Republic wasn't supposed to keep. One entry was from a trooper named Gans. It ended like this: "If I don't make it, tell General Fisto I believed in him, even when I stopped believing in the war." Kit read that line again, then again, and something in his chest pulled back. He hadn't saved Gans, he hadn't even remembered his name until that moment. And yet this clone, bred for war, trained without a childhood, had believed in Kit as a person, not a rank. That night, Kit sat alone in the gunship hangar, watching stars flicker beyond the transparistile. He didn't smile, because the truth had become impossible to ignore. This war wasn't set about peace anymore. It was about control. The clones were never meant to survive it. The Jedi were never meant to question it. And somewhere in the quiet of his own heart, Kit began to wonder if they were all just pieces moved on a board none of them could see. But he kept smiling, not because he wanted to lie, but because the troopers still needed something human in the noise. That was the tragedy of Kit Fisto. He smiled so others wouldn't set break. Until one day they did, and he was left holding a silence he couldn't heal. The corridors of the Jedi Temple were quieter that morning. Not because the halls were empty, they weren't. Younglings still trained, masters still meditated, starships still flew overhead, but something beneath the surface had changed, and Kit Fisto felt it. He stood beside Mace Windu, Aegon Kola, and Sai Tin, waiting for the signal. The Chancellor had revealed himself at last, or rather, Anakin had revealed him. A Sith Lord hidden in the highest office of the Republic, not through darkness or shadow, but through politics, through trust. Kit didn't speak. He rarely did when the feeling in the Force grew thick like this, not sharp like danger, but dull like weight. It sat on his chest as they boarded the gunship, not fear, not anxiety, but something else. Resignation. The Jedi were walking into the Chancellor's office with their blades at their sides, not to protect, not to serve, but to arrest, or to kill. Kit understood what it meant, even if no one said it aloud. The Republic was about to change, and the Jedi were either going to stop it, or be buried with it. The wind howled outside the gunship as it sliced through the sky toward the Senate district. Kit watched the city below. Millions of lives carrying on unaware. The Chancellor was still speaking on the holonet, still holding meetings, still shaking hands, still smiling. But Kit saw none of it as real. He only saw the mask. And behind it, a darkness so still, it made his own breath feel too loud. Mace sat across from him, eyes shut, not in meditation, just waiting. Kit didn't envy him. Windu carried more responsibility than most Jedi knew. He bore the weight of tradition and decision. He had made the call, and Kit had followed. But in those moments of silence before landing, Kit let his mind wander, not to fear, not to anger, but to stillness. He thought of Glee Anselm, the quiet tides of his homeworld, the way the ocean moved without sound, how it carried all things, how it washed over memory. He remembered training younglings in the temple pool, laughing with clones on Camino, breathing deep in the middle of chaos. He remembered fighting side by side with troopers who never smiled but trusted him, who would die for him, who never questioned why. And now, he walked not into battle, but into judgment. The Chancellor's office loomed ahead, high above the city. The gunship slowed. Kit didn't speak. He just looked at Mace and nodded once. There was nothing left to say. The doors slid open with a sound too clean for what waited inside. Palpatine sat alone. The same man they had all stood beside during speeches. The same voice they'd heard echoing in the Senate rotunda. The same hands that once lifted fallen senators from rubble after a separatist attack. But now those hands rested calmly on his desk, as if they didn't belong to the Sith Lord the galaxy had feared for 1,000 years. Kit stood slightly behind Mace, his feet silent against the polished floor. Satine and Agent Kohler flanked them. But Kit didn't look at his brothers. His eyes locked on Palpatine's, and for a moment the Force said nothing. No warning, no push, no whisper, just silence. The Chancellor rose slowly, his voice calm, even kind. Kit had heard that tone before, in the war chambers, in memorial services, in personal messages to fallen Jedi's families. But today, every word it spoke felt like bait. Windu raised his voice, said what needed to be said, declared the arrest. And still, the Force said nothing. That silence was the loudest moment Kit had ever known. For all their training, for all their mastery, the Force had always spoken, if not clearly, then at least with feeling. But now, standing in front of the hidden darkness, there was no feeling, no pulse, only stillness. Palpatine moved. It was too fast. Kit's mind registered it as wrong before his body did. One blink and Agent was gone. A slash of red and Sacy collapsed beside him. The red blade, unfamiliar, yet ancient, burned through the air like lightning pulled from nightmare. Kit moved next. Fluid, precise, his blade ignited, green against crimson. For a breath, it almost looked like balance. He struck low. Palpatine countered. He moved to flank. Palpatine spun faster than flesh should allow. Kit's tentacles swayed with every dodge, every feint, every step that danced between life and finality. But there was no rhythm, because the Force still said nothing. Every duel Kit had ever fought, he felt guided, not by instinct alone, but by something deeper, a pulse of understanding that came from beyond thought. But here now, against this monster in human skin, there was only confusion, not fear. Kit didn't fear death. He had stared it down on Mon Cala, on Ord Cestus, on a dozen battlefields. But this felt wrong. Palpatine grinned. That grin didn't belong on a politician. It belonged on something older, hungrier. Kit lunged again. The Chancellor didn't block. He turned the movement against him, and Kit felt it. The blade entered. Not a slash, a puncture, deep, swift, cold. He didn't cry out, didn't look away. His last breath escaped without resistance. Not in pain, not in shock, but in realization. The Force hadn't warned him, because the end had already been written. His body never hit the floor. Palpatine didn't let it. With one flick of the wrist, Kit's form was tossed aside like discarded robes, crumpled against the edge of the Chancellor's platform. The green glow of his lightsaber flickered out as it rolled from his hand and clattered to stillness. But the silence continued. Windu fought on, alone now. Agent was gone. Seize was gone. Kit was gone. And yet, inside that room, the Force remained still. The battle between Sith and Jedi should have stirred the very air, drawn echoes through the galaxy's fabric. But no tremor came, no thunder in the currents of the Force. It was like watching a storm through glass, real but unreachable. Kit Fisto's eyes were still half open. Lifeless, yes, but fixed on the room as if part of him refused to leave yet. Because he hadn't said anything. Not before the strike, not after. His was a quiet death, not just in sound, but in meaning. No final words, no farewell to the Jedi, no scream, just silence. That was how Kit Fisto died. In a room where light and dark clashed, he became the stillness between them. Not the hero, not the final blow, just the moment when balance broke. Outside, the war raged on. Troopers marched, starships burned through the sky. Jedi continued to fight and die, still believing they could win something, still thinking their place in the galaxy mattered. But inside this room, something larger was falling apart. Palpatine didn't glance at the fallen. He focused on Windu, blade to blade, fury to calm. Their duel spilled across the floor, lights flashing like distant sirens. And Kit remained still. He had once laughed with the clones, once meditated beside Aayla Secura, had once stood alone against the waters of Glee Anselm, and wondered if war had changed him too much to ever return home. But now, none of that mattered. Because this death wasn't set part of the war. This was something else. Kit's life had ended not on a battlefield, but in a lie wrapped in government robes and masked by democracy's voice. He hadn't been killed by a soldier, or even a Sith, really. He'd been killed by trust. Trust in a republic that claimed to serve peace. Trust in leaders who disguised their shadows as strategy. Trust in a force that for once had refused to speak. He didn't know, couldn't know, that soon his name would vanish beneath a list, that his death would be buried between bulletins and betrayals, that the clones who once followed him would turn on Jedi across the stars, executing Order 66 with the same hands they used to offer salute. No, Kit Fisto didn't speak in the Chancellor's office. And after that moment, the galaxy never spoke his name again. There was no body returned to Glee Anselm, no funeral, no pyre. The archives marked him killed in action. That was all. No record of his final thoughts. No transcript of his bravery. Just a date, a name, a status change. But for those who had known Kit Fisto, truly known him, the silence after his death said more than any report. Aayla Secura paused longer in meditation. Shaka T no longer smiled at the temple gates. Even Mace Windu, though he never spoke of Kit afterward, paused for 1 second too long when asked to select his team. And Nada Veb, had he still been alive, would have understood the weight behind that nod Kit gave before entering the Chancellor's chambers. Because that nod wasn't just agreement, it was farewell. Kit had felt it. All of them had in some way, but he didn't let fear show, didn't second-guess the order. He walked forward, not because he thought he would survive, but because someone had to walk forward, someone had to stand in that room, someone had to witness what was about to be unmasked. He knew. The Force may not have shown him the full truth, but it whispered, and Kit always listened, even when it was quiet. He had learned long ago that clarity didn't come from visions or voices. It came from stillness, from presence, from looking at someone, even a clone bred for war, and choosing to see a brother instead of a weapon. He brought that same presence to his last day. No rush, no panic, just calm. Not because he underestimated Palpatine, but because Kit believed, to his final breath, that a Jedi's role wasn't to win, it was to stand where others couldn't. To bear witness, to hold the line, to protect not victory, but meaning. And that sits why his death hurt more than most. Because when the temple fell and Order 66 echoed through the minds of every clone across the galaxy, Kit's legacy vanished into the chaos. There was no one left to remember his quiet courage, no monument carved, no speech given. Just the memory of a man who nodded. That small gesture, offered to Windu to the Force to destiny, was the last honest expression the Jedi ever gave in Palpatine's presence. It wasn't anger, it wasn't hope. It was surrender to duty. Kit didn't fight for the Order. He fought for the idea that Jedi could still choose compassion in the middle of war, that they could still see through the armor, that even in the halls of power, where shadows posed as leaders, someone could walk calmly into the dark and remind it what light used to feel like. He never came back. But that nod still echoes. Not through history books, not through statues, but in the spaces between battles, in the silent loyalty of a clone who hesitated 1 second too long, in the whisper of the Force that now speaks to no one. Kit Fisto died without words, and in doing so, he said everything. He didn't speak as they walked. The halls of the Senate were quiet, but not empty. Every step echoed with the sound of warships landing, of battles being lost, of a republic cracking from the inside. Kit Fisto walked beside Mace Windu, behind him Ajan Kolar and Sazi Tian, 4 Jedi Masters, each carrying the weight of war on their shoulders, and none willing to admit how close they were to the end. Kit's silence wasn't out of fear, it was something else, a knowing, a cold edge brushing against his senses that not even the Force could explain away. The Chancellor's office was just ahead. Every inch of it looked peaceful, sunlight spilling over polished marble, windows stretched wide to show the galactic skyline, but it felt wrong, too clean, too still. The light here wasn't warm, it was hiding something. He didn't need to ask what was coming. He had felt it long before Master Windu requested his presence, a disturbance, a coil of power wrapped in deception. Kit Fisto wasn't surprised when Windu said Palpatine was the Sith Lord. He wasn't shocked when he was asked to help confront him. But that didn't make this walk feel any lighter. He remembered something from before the war, a quiet moment in the Jedi Temple gardens when he taught a group of younglings how to hold their breath beneath water. He'd made them laugh. He'd told them stillness can be powerful. Now that stillness followed him. It was in his throat, in his chest, in the way his hand gripped the lightsaber at his side. Palpatine had fooled the galaxy, fooled the Senate, fooled the Jedi Council for years, and now, in a matter of minutes, it would all break open. The Sith wouldn't hide anymore, and neither could the Jedi. They entered the Chancellor's chamber without a word. Palpatine looked up like he'd been expecting them. No fear, no protest, just that same faint smile he wore when naming Anakin Skywalker to the Council, when giving praise in public and orders in secret. Windu Sepp's voice cut through the stillness. "Chancellor Palpatine, you are under arrest." It sounded strange, even to Kit, like the law was finally catching up to the storm. But the storm had already passed. There was no protest, no argument, just a shift, a flicker, and then everything exploded. But for one breath, before sabers ignited, before death surged through the room, Kit Fisto looked at Palpatine and understood, not just that he was the Sith, but that he had always been ahead. Every battle, every betrayal, every twisted policy, they'd all been by design. Kit had faced darkness before, but this was different. This wasn't darkness growing. This was darkness unveiled. And something inside him whispered, "You won't leave this room." The sound of the lightsabers igniting was sharp, but not startling. It was the timing, the speed, that tore the moment apart. Palpatine moved before anyone could speak again. A blur of red, a snarl of rage and death in motion. Sazi Tian didn't even block. His mind was still reaching for understanding when the blade carved through him. Ajan Kolar raised his saber too late. The crimson blade pierced his gut, and the life left his eyes as he crumpled without a word. 2 Jedi Masters, gone in a second. Kit didn't have time to mourn. His saber was already up, his stance widening. He pivoted left, trying to flank the Sith Lord, but Sidious turned with him, not like a politician hiding power, like a predator shedding skin. This wasn't the Force as Kit had known it. This wasn't calm or focused. It was violent, unchained. The Sith moved like the rules of physics didn't apply to him. And yet, Kit could still see his face. Not just the speed or the strikes, but the eyes. Yellow, alive, merciless. Eyes that had smiled through years of diplomacy. Eyes that had shaken hands with the Jedi Council, that had praised the clones as heroes. Now those same eyes burned with hatred, as if this fight had always been personal. Windu met the storm with power, his strikes precise, relentless. Kit circled, keeping space, watching for an opening. He'd fought alongside Windu in many battles. They were opposites, one calm, the other fierce, but together they had balance. This, though, was different. Sidious wasn't fighting to win, he was fighting to kill, to end the Jedi, to wipe their legacy from the galaxy in blood, and he was nearly succeeding. Kit lunged, his blade humming green, catching Sidious's saber mid-swing. A brief clash, sparks, pressure, then separation. He stepped back, repositioned, but there was no rhythm to this fight, no duel, only survival. He glanced at Windu. The Nautolan Master was holding the line, barely. Every move met with fury, every breath a risk. The Chancellor, the Sith, had waited for this. He wasn't reacting, he was performing. Kit didn't feel fear, but he felt the edge of something worse, inevitability. They had underestimated him, not just his power, but his readiness. Palpatine hadn't hoped to survive this. He had planned to, and now they were fighting him in the place he controlled most, politically, spatially, and in the Force. As Kit dodged another vicious slash, he caught a reflection in the polished floor, the bodies of Saicitian and Aegon Kola, still, empty, forgotten by the war, already. Kit gritted his teeth. If he was going to die, he would die facing his killer, blade ready, mind clear. Not just as a Jedi Master, but as a witness. The Republic hadn't been lost in battle, it had been given away. And this was the receipt. He saw it coming, not in vision, but in rhythm. There was a moment, brief and weightless, when Kit knew the next movement wouldn't be his. The tide had shifted. Sidious wasn't losing control, he was guiding it. Every feint, every flick of the wrist was shaping the room like clay. And Kit, once a warrior who thrived in chaos, now felt the walls closing. Windu shouted something, a warning, maybe a call, but Kit didn't hear it. His focus narrowed to the red blade. Sidious spun. Kit stepped in. And then, silence. A sharp, burning cold passed through his side. His lightsaber didn't deflect it. His hand didn't move fast enough. He was mid-turn, mid-breath, and it had already happened. His blade slipped from his grip. He stayed upright for a heartbeat longer, staring into the Sith's face. There was no celebration there, just certainty, like this death had been rehearsed. Kit's eyes blinked once, not in pain, but in recognition. So this was how it ends. Not in war, not in the skies above a battlefield, but in an office, in the capital, beside the very man they once trusted to protect it. His knees gave way, his body tilted. The floor came up like water, slow, final, cold. He didn't feel fear, not even sorrow. He just remembered. The troopers who called him general but meant friend. The younglings on Glee Anselm who once smiled at his underwater tricks. The council chambers where his jokes lightened the room. And now, none of it mattered. Sidious turned his focus back to Windu. Kit's body lay still, his eyes open but unseeing. To anyone watching, it looked like a Jedi had failed to stop a Sith. But Kit hadn't said failed. He stood in front of evil. He tried, with calm, with skill, with silence. he died facing the truth no one else wanted to see. And in that final second, he didn't think of his rank, he didn't think of the Force. He thought of how close they had come to trusting the wrong man. Because by the time anyone else opened their eyes, he would be gone. And the galaxy would never be the same. The room kept spinning, not in motion, but in meaning. Kit Fisto's body was still on the floor. Ajan Kolar and Sazi Tian had fallen moments earlier. 3 Jedi Masters extinguished almost before their blades had warmed. Mace Windu stood alone now, his saber locked against the red storm. But the silence beneath it all was louder. Something sacred had just broken. Kit had trusted the mission. He had followed without question, not because of obedience but belief. Belief that the Jedi Council was still right, that the Chancellor could still be reasoned with, that maybe the darkness they sensed was just fear exaggerated by war. But now, the Sith stood exposed, not just alive, but laughing. Every lesson they'd taught about patience, about trust, about restraint, it had left them unprepared. Darth Sidious didn't overwhelm them through brute force. He dismantled their assumptions, their hesitation, their faith in the old ways. And Kit died in the middle of it. He had walked into this chamber thinking he was serving the Force, that if this was the end, it would be meaningful. That the Jedi were still protectors, not pawns. But as his breath left him, the truth was simpler. The Jedi had been too late. The Republic didn't belong to them anymore. The Force hadn't warned them in time. The people outside would never know what really happened inside this room. 3 Jedi died. A Sith Lord smiled. The war went on. And nobody stopped to ask why. When the holocrons would record it, if they ever did, Kit Fisto's name might be spoken second, maybe third, another casualty in a duel, another Jedi who tried. But that's not what this was. This was the moment trust died. Trust in the Council, trust in the Senate, trust in the Order's ability to see the darkness before it swallowed everything. Kit's death wasn't just a wound in the Force, it was a warning. A glimpse of how unprepared the Jedi were for the final war. When the Clone Wars began, Kit stood tall, full of confidence, jokes, hope. He was the Jedi who smiled. But when he fell, there was no smile, just silence. A final look of realization. And in that stillness, something else fell with him. Not just a Jedi, but the last pieces of a republic that once believed in light. There were Jedi who commanded armies, Jedi who held firm in war councils, voices sharp, eyes colder than the sabers they carried. And then there was Kit. He never raised his voice, never barked orders, but when he entered a room, the tension cracked like sunlight cutting through fog. Even during the worst days of the Clone Wars, he smiled, not out of arrogance, not out of ignorance, but because he understood something the others didn't. That this war was not his legacy, that the Force didn't abandon kindness when the galaxy chose violence. When Kit died in the Chancellor's office, many mourned quietly, others forgot. There was no memorial for him in the Jedi Temple, no grand speeches, no archived holos highlighting his victories. But those who served beside him, they never needed reminders. They remembered the Jedi, who laughed with clones before battles, who removed his gloves to shake hands, who knew every trooper's name, even when others called them by numbers. And what few outside the Order ever knew was this: Kit had been offered command positions far greater than the ones he held. The Council trusted him. He could have stayed far from the front lines. But he chose not to. Because he believed that peace could not be preached from balconies. It had to be carried, shoulder to shoulder, with those who bled for it. Many Jedi wore the war like a burden. Kit carried it like a responsibility, with grace, with patience, with a quiet sadness that he never let cloud his joy. His smile was not a mask, it was a choice. And for the clones who stood in rain-drenched trenches, for the younglings who watched from the shadows of Coruscant, that smile meant something they couldn't explain. That maybe the Jedi weren't gone yet. That maybe hope could wear tentacles and kindness at the same time. Even in death, Kit never looked like he'd lost. His expression never shifted. His body fell, but his peace remained. Because some Jedi didn't set fight to win. They fought so others didn't have to. Most Jedi kept their distance from the clones, out of discipline, out of fear, out of duty. Some called it wisdom, the need to stay detached. But Kit Fisto didn't believe in distance, not in war, not in life. To his troopers, he wasn't General Fisto, he was just Kit. They ate with him, they laughed with him. When the gunships landed and the ramp dropped, he walked out first. No shield, no hesitation. And when the battle ended, it was Kit who checked on the wounded, who sat in the dirt, not above them, but beside them. He never treated the clones like tools or strategies. He treated them like brothers who hadn't been given a choice. There was a moment, quiet, buried in the outer territories, when his battalion took heavy losses, the kind that broke morale. Kit didn't retreat. He didn't blame command. He simply sat by the fire that night and told them a story from Glee Anselm about deep ocean creatures who survived the crushing pressure of the sea floor, not because they were built stronger, but because they moved together. The men didn't forget that. Neither did the survivors of that mission. Years later, even after the Order fell and the clones were scattered, some still spoke of the Nautolan, who smiled under fire. The Jedi who didn't flinch when bombs shook the earth, who stood tall because he knew someone had to. There are no statues of Kit Fisto on Camino, no name etched in the clone archives, but in the quiet corners of old veteran outposts, his name still stirs something unspoken, a memory not of a commander, but of a friend. He never saw the clones as lesser, and maybe that's why they never forgot him. Because while the galaxy debated who betrayed whom and which Jedi fell to darkness, Kit never changed. Even when Order 66 began, some clones hesitated, just for a breath. Because how do you shoot the one Jedi who treated you like a person? Sometimes, loyalty doesn't show in orders. Sometimes, it shows in the moment you wish you didn't have to follow them. Before he was a Jedi, before the robes, before the title of Master, Kit Fisto belonged to the sea. Glee Anselm didn't just shape his body, it shaped his silence. The way he listened before speaking, the way he moved with others instead of against them. Nautolans were born in pressure and calm, in waters that demanded patience. And Kit carried that ocean with him into every battle, every temple, every council meeting. He swam through conflict the same way he swam through tide currents, not by force but by rhythm. Even his lightsaber style echoed that, flowing, smooth, unpredictable. He didn't duel like a swordsman. He danced like a wave. That's what made him terrifying in combat and graceful in peace. The other Jedi noticed it too. Pulse Koon once said Kit's presence in the temple felt like a tide coming in, soft but strong enough to move the sand. And Obi-Wan, who saw him laugh during some of the worst days of the Clone Wars, once admitted that Kit's smile didn't come from ignorance. It came from knowing just how dark things were and choosing to shine anyway. The sea taught him that light didn't need to shout. It only needed to stay. After his death, when the archives were torn apart and the Jedi records erased, Glee Anselm mourned him in silence. No great procession, no resistance movement, but in the coral homes and undersea schools, children were still told stories about the Jedi who carried the ocean into the stars. They didn't speak of his battles. They spoke of how he returned when others didn't set, how he never forgot where he came from. In the deepest currents of Glee Anselm, there's a tradition. When a Nautolan warrior dies far from home, the elders say the ocean reaches out to find their soul, to carry it back. So maybe Kit Fisto never truly died in that office above Coruscant. Maybe he just returned home, back to where his story began. Back to the one place that always knew who he was, even when the rest of the galaxy forgot. There was no statue built for him, no murals painted across the walls of hidden Jedi enclaves, no holoreels honoring his name in the years that followed. Kit Fisto didn't leave behind a legacy that shouted through history. But that didn't mean he was forgotten. Among the few survivors, Jedi who scattered like stars after the Purge, there were moments when his memory returned, quietly, in the middle of a breath, in the pause between plans and regrets. Someone would remember how he made them laugh during wartime, how he smiled at younglings even when the council was bitter, how he greeted clones like brothers, not tools. He was never the loudest in the room, never the most decorated, but he stayed kind when it was hardest, and after everything, Order 66, the betrayal, the silence that followed, that kindness became rare enough to feel sacred. Some Jedi thought strength was measured by survival, but Kit Fisto's strength wasn't in lasting longer. It was in never changing, even when the galaxy did. Decades later, when Luke Skywalker rebuilt what he could, old names surfaced, names whispered by Force echoes, and somewhere in some quiet archive rebuilt from fragments, a single line survived next to Kit's name. Master of Form, I'd known for his calm and his smile. That was it. Not a war hero, not a martyr, just calm and a smile. But maybe that's what mattered most. In a war that consumed giants and shattered legends, Kit's light didn't vanish in rage or despair. It simply dimmed, like the end of a torch that warmed others more than it ever burned. If the Force remembers anything, perhaps it remembers that, not the speed of his blade, not the rank he held, just the way he treated others when it was easiest not to. Some lights fade, but they do not fail. Kit Fisto's legacy didn't echo in power, it whispered in peace, in the lives he touched, in the quiet places where the Force still flows gently. He smiled, and somewhere even now, that smile remains.